He was a ghost on the wind, a warrior carved from the red rock of the Arizona desert. His name was Naichi, and in the territories that name was spoken with a mix of fear and reverence. At 6'3", he was a giant among his people, an Apache war chief who moved with the deadly grace of a panther. His face, marked with the sacred lines of war paint, was a mask of hard angles and old sorrows, a face that had seen more battle than most men see lifetimes. They said he was the last of the true chiefs, a man who would rather die on his feet in the canyons of his ancestors than live on his knees on a white man's reservation. He was a legend, a whisper, a force of nature. But every legend has a heart, and Naichi's heart belonged to a woman who should have been his enemy. Her name was Paloma. She had hair as black as a desert night and eyes the color of new spring leaves, a startling green that seemed to hold all the mysteries of a world far from the dust and blood of Apache lands. She was a white woman, found among the splintered remains of a missionary wagon train, the only survivor of a brutal bandit raid. Naichi had found her 3 months ago, a fragile dove with a broken wing, and in saving her, he had unknowingly damned himself. Because from the moment he looked into those impossible green eyes, the great war chief was lost. He brought her back to his hidden stronghold, a camp nestled deep in the Dragoon Mountains. He expected her to be terrified, to shrink from his people's rough ways. Instead, she bloomed. She learned their language with a shocking speed, her tongue wrapping around the hard consonants of the Apache tongue, as if she were born to it. She tended to the wounded with a gentle hand, learned the names of the sacred herbs from the old women, and sang lullabies to the orphaned children whose parents had been lost to the blue-coated cavalry. She moved among them not as a prisoner, but as a long-lost daughter. And Naichi, who had sworn his life to his people, found himself watching her every move, his chest tight with an emotion he hadn't felt since he was a boy, long before the world had tried to grind him and his people into dust. It was a dangerous feeling, a weakness, a love that could get them all killed. Tonight, under a sky bleeding crimson and gold, he stood with her on a high mesa overlooking their camp. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the distant sound of drums and the scent of cook fires. He had made his decision, a decision that would defy his ancestors, challenge his counsel, and possibly ignite a war within his own tribe. He turned to her, his shadow stretching long and dark across the land. "Paloma," he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. She looked up at him, her face pale in the dying light. He could see the fear in her eyes, but it wasn't fear of him. It was something deeper, something she had carried with her since the day he found her. "Naichi," she whispered back, her voice trembling, "there is something I have to tell you." The great warrior, who had faced down cavalry charges and stared into the eyes of death without flinching, felt a cold dread wash over him. He had seen that look before, in the moments before a trap was sprung, in the instant before an ambush was unleashed. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever she was about to say would change everything. Forever. "Speak," he commanded, his voice softer than he intended. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers, stained with war paint and the earth itself, closing around her delicate ones. She took a shaky breath, her green eyes filling with tears. She pressed her free hand against her stomach, a gesture so fleeting he almost missed it. "When I was a girl," she began, her voice cracking, "a fever took hold of me. The white man's medicine man, he said it burned away something inside. He said I was damaged." She looked him straight in the eye, the tears now carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Naichi, I cannot give you a son. I cannot give you an heir." The words hit him like a physical blow. An heir. For an Apache chief, it was everything. It was the continuation of the bloodline, the future of the tribe, the sacred duty passed down from his father and his father's father. To lead his people, to secure their survival, he needed a son to carry on his name and his strength. A barren wife, especially a white one, was not just a disappointment, it was a political disaster. It was a sign of weakness the elders would never accept. He could feel her waiting, braced for the rejection, for the anger, for the cold finality of his duty crushing this fragile thing between them. He should have let go of her hand. He should have turned his back and walked away, back to the life he was born for. But he didn't. Instead, he tightened his grip. He pulled her closer until she was pressed against his chest, until he could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. "If we cannot make a child from our blood," he said, his voice raw with a sudden, fierce revelation, "then we will make a family from our hearts." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, with a hope so fragile it terrified him. "What? What do you mean?" "There are children in our camp," he said, his gaze sweeping over the flickering lights of the lodges below. "Children whose parents the soldiers have taken. Chapo, Desba, Little Coyote. They have no mother, no father. They have only the tribe. We will be their parents. We will raise them. All of them." He looked back down at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to scorch the very air between them. "I am not asking you to be the mother of my son, Paloma. I am asking you to be the mother of my people." It was an insane idea, a radical departure from centuries of tradition. But as he said the words, he knew they were true. This was the only path forward. This was how they would survive. Not just by fighting, but by loving. Before she could answer, before she could even process the enormity of what he was offering, he dropped to one knee. The great war chief Naichi, who bowed to no man, knelt in the dust before this white woman. "Marry me, Paloma. Be my wife. Be my partner. Stand with me against all that is to come." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. "Yes," she breathed, a sound snatched away by the wind. "Yes, I will be your wife." He rose, pulling her into a fierce embrace, and kissed her with all the pent-up desperation of a man who had just found water after a lifetime in the desert. In that moment, with the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky, they were not an Apache and a white woman. They were just a man and a woman, clinging to each other on the edge of a hostile world. But they were not alone. From the shadows of a distant ridge, a pair of eyes watched them through a spyglass. Sergeant William Hayes of the 7th Cavalry lowered the brass instrument, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He had been tracking this band for weeks, waiting for a weakness, an opening. And he had just found it. A white woman, the chief's obsession. "He's distracted," Hayes muttered to himself, the desert wind whipping at his dusty blue uniform. "He's in love." The sergeant spat on the ground. Love was for fools and civilians. In this land, it was nothing but a liability, an easy way to get a man killed. And Sergeant Hayes was very, very good at killing. He had his orders: eradicate the last of the renegade Apaches. And now, he had the key. He would not just destroy Naichi's band. He would break the chief's heart first. He would take the woman and make Naichi watch. As Naichi and Paloma walked hand in hand back toward the camp, filled with a defiant hope for the future they would build together, they had no idea that the real battle wasn't for land or for freedom. It was for her, and it had already begun. The council fire crackled, spitting embers into the pre-dawn sky. 7 men sat in a circle, their faces like ancient maps, etched with the canyons and ravines of a hard life. These were the elders, the warriors who had fought alongside Naichi's father, the keepers of Apache law. Their judgment was absolute. They could make a chief, and they could break one. Naichi stood before them, Paloma at his side. He could feel her trembling, but her back was straight, her head held high. She wore a simple buckskin dress Naichi's sister had given her, a silent gesture of support, but it did little to soften the hard stares of the council. To them, she was an outsider, a ghost, a white woman who had no place in their world. The air was thick with tension. Every warrior in the camp was watching, their faces grim. They knew what this was, not a request for marriage, but a trial. Naichi spoke, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the quiet morning. He told them of Paloma's courage, of her kindness to the children, of the way she had embraced their culture. He told them he wished to make her his wife. A low murmur went through the council. It was Ju, a hard-faced warrior whose hatred for the whites was legendary, who spoke first. His voice was like stones scraping together. "She is white, Naichi. Her skin is the color of our enemies. In a time when our people are vanishing like the morning mist, you would choose a woman who cannot give us Apache children to carry on our fight? The challenge was laid bare. It was the question Nietzsche had been dreading, the question he had a radical, dangerous answer for. But before he could speak, Paloma did something that stunned the entire council into silence. She stepped forward, alone. "What you says is true," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She spoke in their tongue, flawlessly. "I cannot bear children." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Nietzsche's heart hammered in his chest. This was not the plan. For her to admit it herself so bluntly, it was suicide. He saw the grim satisfaction on Yu's face. He had won. The white woman had condemned herself. "An illness I had as a child left me barren," Paloma continued, her gaze sweeping over the stone-faced elders. "I cannot give your chief a son of his own blood. If that makes me unworthy to stand beside him, then I will accept your judgment and leave this camp today." The silence that followed was absolute. Nietzsche was frozen. She was offering to sacrifice herself, to walk away from him, from the only home she had, to protect him from his own choice. He saw the flicker of doubt in the eyes of some of the elders. They respected her courage, her honesty, but tradition was a powerful current, and it was pulling them all toward the inevitable conclusion. Ju smiled, a predator sensing the kill. "She has spoken the truth. She is of no use to our people. She must go." But then, the oldest member of the council, a wizened man named Mangas, whose eyes had seen nearly a century of struggle, slowly rose to his feet. He was so old he was more spirit than man, and when he spoke, his voice was the whisper of dry leaves. "In the time of my grandfather," Mangas began, his ancient eyes fixed on Paloma, "a great sickness swept through our lands. It took many of our children. The women who could still bear sons were honored above all others. But there was one woman, a great medicine woman, who had been barren since her youth. The other women pitied her. The warriors overlooked her." He paused, letting his story settle over the silent crowd. "But when the sickness came, it was not the mothers who saved us. They were busy tending to their own. It was the barren woman who went from lodge to lodge, who knew the ancient remedies, who sat with the dying and nursed the sick back to health. She had no children of her own blood, so she made all the tribe's children her own." Mangas turned his gaze from Paloma to Nietzsche and then to the other council members. "A woman's worth is not measured by what comes from her womb. It is measured by what comes from her heart. This woman, this Paloma, she came to us with nothing, and she has given us her heart." He looked at Ju, his old eyes sharp and clear. "That is more than some men who were born Apache can say." The old man's words shifted the very ground beneath their feet. He had not just defended Paloma. He had honored her, using their own history as his weapon. He had reframed her barrenness not as a weakness, but as a potential strength. Nietzsche seized the moment. "Mangas speaks with the wisdom of the ancestors," he boomed, stepping forward to stand beside Paloma once more, his hand finding hers. "Paloma cannot have one child, so we will give her 20. Chapo, Despa, Little Coyote, all the orphans of this war. They will be our children. We will raise them in the Apache way. We will build a future not on the purity of blood, but on the strength of our spirit." It was a speech that would be told around campfires for 100 years, a chief choosing a barren white wife and declaring the tribe's orphans as his heirs. It was madness. It was blasphemy. It was hope. You could feel the tide turning. The stony faces of the elders softened. The warriors watching from the shadows nodded in grudging respect. They were a people on the brink of extinction. Maybe this new crazy idea was exactly what they needed to survive. But just as the council leader, a scarred veteran named Victorio, was about to give his blessing, a commotion erupted at the edge of the camp. A young scout, his face pale with fear, burst into the council circle. "Soldiers!" he gasped, breathing heavily. "Cavalry! They are coming from the east. A war party with a big wagon gun." Panic swept through the camp. A howitzer. That meant they weren't coming to capture them. They were coming to annihilate them, to blow their rock-walled sanctuary to dust. Nietzsche's mind raced. How? How could they have found this place? It was a secret passed down for generations. Only a handful of his most trusted warriors knew the path. It was impossible. Unless, his eyes narrowed and he scanned the faces of his council. Ju stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. But Naichi saw it. A flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise, not fear. Triumph. Naichi felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the approaching soldiers. The enemy wasn't just riding toward them from the east. The enemy was already inside. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women began packing supplies. Warriors grabbed their rifles, the grim calculus of survival taking over. The plan was always the same. Run, hide, live to fight another day. But Naichi stood like a statue in the center of the storm, his mind a whirlwind. A traitor. The thought was a venomous snake coiling in his gut. One of his own had sold him to the cavalry. "We must move the women and children to the high caves," Victorio said, his voice the steady command of a seasoned general. "No!" Naichi's voice cut through the noise like a knife. Every head turned toward him. "We have been running for too long. Today we do not run. Today we fight." "Fight?" Ju scoffed, stepping forward. "Against 40 soldiers and a cannon? We are but 12 warriors. It is suicide." "It is only suicide if they find us where they expect us to be," Naichi countered, his eyes locking onto Ju's. He held the other man's gaze, a silent accusation passing between them. Ju's expression didn't waver, but a tiny muscle twitched in his jaw. Then Paloma spoke, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that made everyone listen. The soldier leading them, his name is Sergeant Hayes. Naichi turned to her, surprised. "You know him?" She nodded, her face grim. "He was there when the bandits attacked my wagon train." A dark shadow passed over her features. "Only they weren't bandits, Naichi. They were his soldiers, dressed as raiders." The world seemed to stop. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't a random raid. It was a massacre, and Hayes was the butcher. "He killed them all," Paloma whispered, her voice thick with old trauma. "The missionaries, the women, everyone. I hid under a wagon. I saw his face. He was laughing." She looked up at Naichi, her green eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "I am the only witness. He is not here just to kill Apaches, Naichi. He is here to silence me." Now it all made sense. The relentless pursuit, the determination. This wasn't a military operation. It was a personal vendetta. Hayes was tying up a loose end. And the traitor had not just given away their location, he had given away Paloma. "He is arrogant," Paloma said, her mind now sharp and tactical. "He thinks Apaches only know how to run or how to fight in the open. He will expect us to be cowering in the valley. He will bring his cannon to the mouth of the canyon and shell us into oblivion." "But we will not be in the valley," Naichi said, a deadly plan already forming in his mind. He looked around at his warriors, at the council. "We will be on the canyon walls. We will let him walk into the heart of our land, and then we will turn his tomb into ours." A trap. A brilliant, desperate, all-or-nothing trap. The warriors' eyes lit up with a fierce, renewed hope. This was the kind of fighting they were born for. Not running, but hunting. "We will need to block the canyon entrance behind them," Victorio added, his mind already working through the logistics. "Rock falls. And the exit," Naichi commanded. "They will ride in, and they will never ride out." As the warriors dispersed to prepare the ambush, Naichi pulled Paloma aside. "Why did you never tell me the truth about the attack?" he asked, his voice low. "Because I was ashamed," she admitted, looking at the ground. "And afraid. If you knew I was wanted by the army, that I was a danger to you and your people." "You are one of my people," he said fiercely, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Your enemies are my enemies. His crime against you will be answered in Apache blood." He looked into her eyes, seeing not the fragile woman he had rescued, but a warrior in her own right. "You know this man, Hayes. You know how he thinks. You will help me plan this battle." It was an unprecedented honor. A woman, a white woman, being asked to help plan a war strategy. But at that moment, no one questioned it. They had all seen the fire in her. She was no longer Paloma, the outsider. She was the white buffalo, the sacred spirit Mangus had spoken of, who would lead them to salvation. They worked for 2 days, turning the canyon into a perfectly calibrated machine of death. Boulders were positioned, firing lines were established, escape routes for the women and children were secured. Naichi oversaw it all, but it was Paloma who provided the crucial insights into the military mind. They will send scouts first. They will be overconfident. Hayes will be at the front, wanting to see the destruction himself. During the preparations, Naichi watched Yu. The warrior worked as hard as anyone, his face a mask of grim determination. He was playing his part perfectly. Too perfectly. On the night before the battle, Naichi went to his most trusted friend, the young warrior named Cochise, a distant cousin of the great chief. "I want you to watch Ju," Naichi whispered. "Do not let him out of your sight. If he tries to signal the soldiers, you know what to do." Cochise nodded, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Later that night, as Paloma cleaned her rifle by the fire, Naichi sat beside her. The weight of the coming battle, of the betrayal, of the incredible risk they were taking, pressed down on him. "Are you afraid?" he asked her. She looked up from her work, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I was afraid every day in the white world," she said softly. "Afraid of being a woman with no family and no prospects. Afraid of being alone. Here with you, with our people, even facing a cannon. I am not afraid." She reached out and touched the war paint on his cheek. "Tomorrow we show them what it means to fight for a family." But as they shared that quiet moment, a shadow detached itself from the rocks at the edge of the camp. It was Ju. He thought he was unobserved. He slipped into the darkness, moving toward the east, toward the approaching cavalry. From another set of rocks, Cochise watched him go. He drew his knife, the polished steel glinting in the moonlight. He was about to follow, to deliver the chief's justice. But then he paused. Naichi had said to watch him. He hadn't specified what to do if he left the camp. A thought struck the young warrior. What if the chief already knew? What if this too was part of the plan? Cochise hesitated, his mind racing. To kill you now would be simple justice. But what if the traitor was not just a traitor? What if he was bait? Cochise made a decision that would seal all their fates. He lowered his knife. He did not follow Ju. Instead, he slipped back toward Naichi's lodge. He had to warn the chief. The traitor was on his way to the enemy, and the trap they had so carefully laid was about to be blown wide open. The desert sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the Red Canyon walls. From his perch high above the canyon floor, Naichi watched the column of blue-coated soldiers ride into view. They moved with a casual arrogance, dust rising from their horses' hooves in a lazy plume. At the front, just as Paloma had predicted, rode Sergeant Hayes, his spyglass periodically raised to scan the silent, empty valley ahead. Beside Naichi, Paloma lay perfectly still, her rifle resting on a rocky ledge. She was a different woman now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, focused calm. This was not a battle for her. It was an execution. "They are coming," Cochise whispered from his position nearby. The young warrior had delivered his message last night. Ju had slipped away, undoubtedly to warn Hayes of the trap. Naichi had received the news with a grim nod. His heart ached at the betrayal, but his mind saw the opportunity. "He thinks he is betraying us," Naichi had told Cochise and Paloma, "but he is merely changing the shape of the trap." Now that new trap was about to be sprung. The cavalry column entered the canyon, the clatter of hooves and the rumble of the howitzer carriage echoing off the stone walls. They rode past the first kill zone, the spot where the main rockfall was planned. Ju would have told them about that. Hayes would be expecting it, feeling clever for avoiding it. He would press deeper into the canyon, looking for the cowering Apaches he believed were trapped at the far end. "Let them come," Naichi murmured, his hand raised, signaling his 12 warriors, hidden along the cliffs to hold their fire. The entire column, all 40 men and their cannon, moved past the first ambush point and into the narrowest part of the canyon, a section they called the gut. The walls here were sheer, offering no cover, no escape. This was the real trap. Hayes reined in his horse, a confused frown on his face. The valley was empty. There were no signs of a camp. He raised his spyglass again, scanning the caves at the far end. Something was wrong. This was too easy. That's when he saw him, a lone figure standing on a high ledge at the very end of the canyon. It was Ju. He was waving his arms, signaling frantically. But he wasn't signaling a location. He was signaling a warning. He had realized, too late, that he had been used. Hayes spun around, his eyes wide with sudden understanding. It's a trap! Back out! Get the cannon turned around! But it was too late. Naichi dropped his hand. The world exploded. From both sides of the canyon, a volley of rifle fire erupted, a deafening roar that sent horses screaming and men tumbling from their saddles. Simultaneously, from the canyon entrance behind them, Victorio and his men released the first rockfall, a massive avalanche of boulders that sealed their only escape route. Then from the far end, Mangus and the older men released a second landslide, blocking the path forward. The cavalry was perfectly, hopelessly boxed in. The gut had become a tomb. Chaos reigned on the canyon floor. Soldiers scrambled for cover that didn't exist, their disciplined lines dissolving into a panic-stricken mob. The howitzer crew struggled to unhitch the massive gun, but they were exposed, easy targets. Naichi's warriors, firing from their protected positions, were devastatingly effective. Naichi sighted his rifle, his target not a random soldier, but the heart of the serpent. He found Hayes, who was bellowing orders, trying desperately to rally his men. Naichi squeezed the trigger, but at that exact moment, Paloma fired. Her shot was true, striking the cannon's wheel and shattering the axle. The massive gun tipped sideways, its barrel pointing uselessly at the sky. She had neutralized their biggest threat with a single brilliant shot, but her action had a cost. The muzzle flash gave away her position. Hayes saw it. His face twisted with rage and disbelief as he recognized the woman on the cliff. "You!" he roared, his voice echoing in the canyon. "You treacherous bitch!" He raised his own carbine, taking aim not at Naichi, but at her. Time slowed down. Naichi saw the rifle leveling, saw Hayes's finger tighten on the trigger. He fired his own weapon, but he knew he was a fraction of a second too late. He saw the puff of smoke from Hayes's rifle. He saw Paloma jolt backward, a cry of pain torn from her lips as she was thrown against the rock wall behind her. She slid down, her rifle clattering on the stones, and lay still. A red-hot fury, primal and absolute, exploded in Naichi's chest. The world went silent, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull roar. There was nothing but the man below and the woman he had just shot. He let out a war cry that was not human, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. He dropped his rifle. He drew the massive knife from his belt, and he did something no sane war chief would ever do. He began to run, down the treacherous, nearly vertical cliff face, leaping from rock to rock with impossible speed and agility. He was no longer a strategist, no longer a leader. He was an avenger, an avalanche of muscle and fury descending upon the man who had hurt his heart. The soldiers on the canyon floor saw him coming, a terrifying apparition of painted fury, and they fell back in awe and terror. They had heard stories of the Apache ghost, but they had never believed them. Now they did. Hayes, his face pale, tried to reload his carbine, his hands fumbling with the cartridges. He was a brave man, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, but what was coming for him was not a man. It was a spirit of vengeance. Naichi hit the canyon floor running, never breaking stride. He covered the 50 yards to Hayes in a heartbeat, a blur of motion and deadly intent. The remaining soldiers, seeing their leader about to be overrun, finally broke. They threw down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. The battle was over, but Naichi's war was not. He crashed into Hayes, the force of the impact sending both men sprawling in the dust. Hayes came up swinging his empty rifle like a club. Naichi ducked under the blow, his knife flashing. The carbine clattered to the ground, Hayes's hand sliced open and bleeding. The sergeant staggered back, his face a mask of pain and fear. "Wait!" he gasped. Naichi stalked forward, his knife held low, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "You shot her," he growled, his voice a low, guttural threat. "She was a traitor," Hayes spat, trying to justify himself. "She was a witness. I had to silence her." "A witness to what?" Naichi pressed. wanting to hear the confession before he sent the man to his gods. Hayes laughed then, a desperate, broken sound. You think that raid was about some missionaries? It was a payroll wagon. Gold. My men and I took it. We were setting ourselves up for life. He glanced up toward the ledge where Paloma lay. She saw us. The little fool survived. I've been hunting her ever since. He looked back at Naichi, a cruel, final sneer on his face. But that's not the best part, Chief. Naichi paused, his knife hand steady. You want to know about the fever that made your precious white squaw barren? Hayes taunted, blood dripping from his hand onto the dusty ground. There was no fever. It was my saber. During the raid, I ran her through myself, right in the gut. I left her for dead in a burning wagon. He grinned, a bloody, triumphant leer. So you see, every time you touch her, every time you look at her, and dream of a son you'll never have, you have me to thank for it. The confession hung in the air, more brutal than any bullet. He was the source of all her pain, the fever, the barrenness, the massacre. It was all him. He had not just tried to kill her today. He had been killing her, slowly, for years. Naichi looked up at the ledge where his warriors, Kochisi among them, were now kneeling beside Paloma's still form. He couldn't see if she was breathing. He didn't know if she was alive or dead. He looked back at the monster standing before him, and he finally understood. Justice was not enough. Some sins required a different kind of payment. He raised his knife, the polished blade reflecting the pitiless Arizona sun. The canyon fell silent. The only sounds the moans of the wounded and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Naichi stood over what was left of Sergeant Hayes, his chest heaving, his hands stained with a righteous fury. He felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction. Only a hollow, aching void where his heart used to be. He turned and scrambled back up the cliff face, his movements clumsy now, desperate. When he reached the ledge, Kogise and the others moved aside. Paloma lay on the dusty rock, her eyes closed, her face as pale as desert sand. A dark stain was spreading across the front of her buckskin dress, high on her shoulder. Naichi dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he gently tore away the fabric. The bullet had gone clean through, high on the fleshy part of her shoulder. A painful wound, a bloody wound, but not a fatal one. She had likely been knocked unconscious when her head hit the rock. Relief, so powerful it almost buckled him, washed through Naichi. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, his face buried in her raven hair. Paloma, he whispered, his voice cracking. White dove, do not leave me. Her eyelids fluttered. Her green eyes, hazy with pain, opened and found his. A faint smile touched her lips. Did we win? She breathed. We won, he said, his own tears tracing paths through the war paint and dust on his face. We won. Down below, the Apache warriors were rounding up the surviving soldiers. They found Ju hiding behind a rock, weeping with shame and terror. They dragged him before Victorio. The old warrior looked at the traitor with disgust. Banishment was the sentence. He would be stripped of his weapons and sent out into the desert to survive on his own. In this land, it was a fate worse than death. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the canyon of their victory, the Apache prepared to leave. They took the cavalry's horses, rifles, ammunition, and supplies. They had won more than a battle. They had secured their future. They now had the means to travel far and fast, deep into the Sierra Madre of Mexico, where no American soldier would ever find them. They carried Paloma on a litter, tending to her wound with ancient poultices of herbs and whispered prayers. Naichi never left her side. He held her hand as they traveled through the night, the stars a brilliant canopy above them. 3 weeks later, they found their new home, a hidden valley, lush and green, with a spring of clear, sweet water and abundant game. It was a paradise, a place to heal, a place to begin again. When Paloma was strong enough to walk, Naichi led her to the edge of a small, clear lake in the center of their valley. The entire tribe, their new battle-forged family, had gathered. The orphan children, Chapo and Despa, and all the others, stood at the front, their eyes wide with anticipation. Mangas, the ancient elder, stepped forward, a cord woven from eagle feathers and sagebrush in his wrinkled hands. "We were a people of the desert," he said, his voice carrying across the water. "Scattered, hunted, broken. But the Great Spirit sent us a sign, a white buffalo, who taught us that a family is not made of blood, but of choice, and a great chief, who taught us that a leader's strength is not in his fist, but in his heart." He took Naichi's hand, then Paloma's, and began to wrap the sacred cord around their joined wrists, binding them together. "By the power of the mountains that shelter us and the water that gives us life," Mangus chanted, "by the memory of the ancestors and the hope of the children to come, I pronounce you husband and wife. What has been forged in fire and blood, let no man tear asunder." Naichi turned to Paloma. Her green eyes shone with a light that outshone the sun. He was no longer just a war chief. He was a husband, a father, a builder. He leaned down and kissed his wife, and the whole tribe erupted in a joyous cheer that echoed through their new home. After the ceremony, as the celebration began, little Chapo tugged on Paloma's dress. "Mother," he said, using the Apache word, "will you still teach me to track rabbits?" Paloma knelt, wincing slightly from her healing wound, and pulled the boy into a hug. "Every day, my son," she promised, "I will teach you to track, and I will teach you to read the white man's books, and your father will teach you how to be a warrior who fights only to protect, never to hate." Naichi watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over him for the first time in his life. He looked around at the valley, at the children playing, at the warriors laughing, at the women preparing a feast. They had walked through the fire and come out stronger. They had lost their homeland, but they had found themselves. Later that night, as they stood outside their new lodge, Paloma leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked quietly. "What he said, that he's the reason—" Naichi put a finger to her lips, silencing her. "He was a poison," he said, his voice firm, "and we have cut him out. His actions do not define us. He did not make you barren, my love. He revealed your true purpose." He gestured to the camp, to the dozens of children who now called them mother and father. "He tried to leave you with nothing. Instead, he gave you everything." She turned in his arms, her eyes shining with love and gratitude. They had taken the greatest pains of their lives and transformed them into their greatest strengths. Her inability to have a child had made her the mother of a nation. His duty to his bloodline had been transformed into a duty to his people's spirit. They had created something new under the sun, a tribe built not on the past but on the future, a family bound not by blood but by love. The legend of the Apache war chief and his white buffalo wife would be whispered on the winds of the Sierra Madre for generations, a story of how true love and true courage could not just conquer the impossible, it could build a whole new world from its ashes. What an incredible story. Naichi and Paloma faced down betrayal, hatred, and an entire army to build a life together. They proved that family isn't about blood, but about who you're willing to fight for. If their story of unbreakable love moved you, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps our channel more than you know and allows us to keep bringing you these powerful tales of survival and the human spirit. Join our storytelling family and let us know in the comments below. What was the most shocking twist for you? We'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.